We go ahead and bid everybody now?
Yes, please. Judith, we're going to let everyone in the room. Hello, everyone. As you know, we're going to wait just a moment to let everyone come in from the waiting room, and then we'll get started. Great, wonderful. Hello, welcome, everyone. My name is Rachel Lucy Hitt. I'm Education Director at the Holocaust Memorial Resource and Education Center. On behalf of all of us at the center, welcome here to another In My Own Words. Today, we're very lucky to have Judith Rapp Hara with us. I'll let you know a little bit more about her, and we'll get to hear her story in just a moment. But as always, just a reminder that today's session will be recorded. You will have access to it very shortly after the program concludes. If you want to go back and watch anything, or of course, if you'd like to share this with someone else that wasn't able to be here today, that would be wonderful. In addition, we always try to take as many questions as possible towards the end of the program. So please be sure, if you have any thoughts, questions, comments, please be sure to go ahead and put that into the chat box. And Judith will try to answer as many of them as we have time for. So with that said, Judith Rapp Hara is the second of 3 daughters born to Ernest and Sylvia Rapp in New York City in 1949. At age 6, the family moved to Orlando area, where her father began a successful career as an architect. Judith was educated in the Orange County Public School system, as well as earning a BS in nursing from the University of Florida, as well as my alma mater. She got a master's in counseling from Rollins College. Her interest in the Holocaust and much of its literature comes from the many stories shared by her parents, her late parents. In 2020, Judith wrote the short book, Journey, about her parents' experiences in Europe and the United States. Today, she's going to share some of those stories with us. So welcome, Judith. Thank you for joining us today. All the way from, even though she's local to Central Florida, where are you located now?
Right now, I'm in Manhattan, in New York.
Wonderful that even though you're visiting family in New York, that you're still able to be with us on here today. Welcome.
It's a pleasure.
I was wondering if you would mind, when you shared your story with us, your book, and we knew we wanted to make sure that we did some programming around it. I think that, the prologue, in your book really sets the stage for some of the stories that you're going to share today. Would you mind reading that for us?
I would be delighted, because actually this is my favorite part of the book. In 1973, my husband Bob and I spent time in Israel. While there, we met a delightful elderly gentleman from Belfast, Ireland. He was ill at the time and hoping to relocate to Israel. We became friends over the next 2 weeks and decided to remain in touch. He returned to Ireland and we came home to Orlando. Once home, we showed our pictures of our trip to Israel to our family. When we got to the picture of me and our elderly friend, my father paled. He said, "Who is that man?" By the way, the picture in the corner of the screen, that is the picture that showed my father. I told my father that his name was Harry Cohen and that he was from Belfast, Ireland. My father paled. He said, "I've been looking for this man since the war. He's the man who saved our family." I told my father that I would write Harry Cohen in Ireland and see if he was indeed this man. It took 2 weeks to get the letter to Ireland and 2 weeks to get the return letter. Harry Cohen wrote that, yes, he remembered my father, grandfather, and aunt, and enclosed a photograph of my family and himself, dated 1939. He was the man. We were overjoyed to get this news. I immediately wrote him that my father was deeply indebted to him for helping them, and that my father would write him so that they could connect once again. There was no more contact with Harry Cohen. All the letters were returned after that. I believe that we were supposed to meet him in Israel so he could find out that the Rapp family survived thanks to him. Then his life was complete. That is when I learned that there are no coincidences.
Thank you. The no coincidences, that is, I think, what really drew me in to your family's story, and is a theme that we're going to talk about throughout today, and especially in some of your concluding stories there. And this, do you want to tell everyone, this is actually a picture, right, of you meeting Harry Cohen?
Yes, this is a picture taken in Israel, in the Kibbutz Lavi, in the Upper Galilee in Israel. And my husband Bob took the photo, and we befriended this wonderful gentleman. The problem was I never told him my name was Rapp, and how I wish I had. But it was such a magnet between him and us that when we were on the kibbutz for those 2 weeks, we ate dinner with him every night. I didn't know the connection at the time, but I wasn't that surprised when I found out what the connection was.
So can we explore that connection a little bit more? I mean, that's such a big thing to start out with, that this is the man that saved your father's family. So can we learn a little bit more about your father and their story and the connection with Harry Cohen?
Certainly. So my father, Ernest David Rapp, was the second child. Actually, there's a photograph there of the family, but he was the second child. My grandparents, Ozias and Ethel Meltzer Rapp, were born in a little shtetl in Poland called Sniatin, and they lived there. My grandfather served in World War I, fighting for the Kaiser in Germany, and was actually obtained the Iron Cross Medal for helping. He was in communication, and he read a telegram from Russia and interpreted it that there was going to be a battle fought from Russia on Germany, and because he saved the day, he got the Iron Cross Medal for that. So my grandparents married in Sniatin, and they had my aunt, my father's older sister, Berta, there. In 1918, they moved to Vienna, Austria, where my father was born. And that is a picture of the family. My grandfather and my father is in his arms, and there's my aunt Berta, and then my grandmother Ethel. When my father was 10 years old, my grandmother died of rheumatic fever, which was very, very traumatic on the family of three. My father, as he grew up, showed an interest in art and architecture, and in the high school years, called the gymnasium, he went to the Vienna School of Art and Architecture, where he excelled. To make a little extra money, he designed dress patterns for a manufacturing company in Belfast, Ireland. Then March 12, 1938, the Anschluss came, and that is when Nazi Germany marched into Austria, and the Austrians welcomed them with open arms. Life for the Jews became very bad very quickly, and the Jews lived in absolute terror from the start. My father recalled that the SS soldiers had him scrubbing the sidewalk with a toothbrush. He went to his beloved school and was thrown literally out the window and told never to return. Because my father was born in Austria, he had Austrian documentation. My grandfather and my Aunt Bertha had Polish documentation. So when my father tried to get out very quickly, it was easier for him with the Austrian documentation to leave. he contacted the Belfast community, actually to the factory, and they sponsored him. So he got out very early in the war, knowing that he was 19 years old, and that's the picture of him when he was leaving Austria. He had his father and his sister behind and had to get them out somehow. So my father arrived in Belfast, and he was poor and had no money. He did not speak English. So he did what an Orthodox Jew would do, and he went to the synagogue in Belfast. And there he met the president of the synagogue, Harry Cohen, the Harry Cohen that I met many years later. And Mr. Cohen put him up, listened to his story, and got the synagogue to raise the money and to get the paper to get my grandfather and my aunt out of Austria and to Ireland. Meanwhile, my father had a lot of ambition, and he believed that America, the streets were paved with gold, and he wanted to go to New York. So he earned the money, and he got sponsorship from a distant cousin, Isaac Epstein, in New Jersey, and he left for New York on late December 28, 1938. Meanwhile, my grandfather and aunt didn't arrive in Belfast till March of 1939. So my father was actually already in New York when they arrived in Belfast. And my father's goal was to work as many jobs as possible to obtain passage for his father and sister to join him. He did obtain passage, and on September 1st, 1939, my grandfather and aunt left Belfast on the ship the USS Athenia and headed for New York. 2 days later, the ship was torpedoed in the Atlantic Ocean, and the ship was going down. And my grandfather told the story that he told his daughter that they should tie their arm locks to the lifeboat so that if a wave came, they wouldn't be thrown overboard. They were in different lifeboats and didn't know what was happening to the other. Meanwhile, my father was in New York and heard that the USS Athenia had been torpedoed. And by the way, that is when England declared war on Germany on that day. And he saw that they were not on the list of survivors. So my father, being that his father and sister were the most important people in his life, he actually had a nervous breakdown and was hospitalized for 2 weeks. Meanwhile, back in the Atlantic Ocean, my grandfather and aunt were floating on the lifeboat, and the British Royal Navy picked them up and took them to Scotland and put them in prison because they had no documentation, they did not speak English, and they believed that they were enemy combatants. While in prison in Scotland, my grandfather and aunt refused to eat the non-kosher food, which alerted the Scottish authorities that maybe there was another story behind them. They contacted a rabbi who talked to them and realized that they were aliens from Austria and that they were not enemy combatants. He contacted Harry Cohen in Belfast, and Mr. Cohen sent a delegation to Scotland to get them out of prison, and then 2 weeks later sent them on their way to New York, where they were reconciled with my father.
Wow, that's only one side of your family's, like, part of their story, but how amazing! What an amazing story, and the ups and downs of what they had to go through, and even trying to just kind of follow one another on this pathway to try to reunite. What's wonderful, though, that in all of that hardship that they had to go through, that there were people along the way, especially within the Jewish community, that helped them, right? That helped them not only escape, right, to save their lives in that way, but also help them to reunite. First, trying to in Belfast, but then actually in the United States. That's absolutely amazing.
And that's the ship, the USS Athenia.
Yeah. And actually, that was something, you know, if you look that up, that was obviously a very big news story, as you said, right, with England and during the war. Um, there's a lot of information on this. And so I thank you for sharing also not just the timeline and what happened, but that this has real impact, right, on people and emotions and how your father responded in all the work that he was doing to try to save them and bring them over to reunite with him, only to think that they had died along the way. So why don't we, we're going to come back to this story and pieces of how this all comes together, especially with, you know, Carrie going. But if you could tell us a little bit about your mother's side as well, so we can start putting these different pieces and timelines together a little bit.
Okay, so my mother was also born in Vienna, Austria, only it was a very different upbringing. My mother, Hertha Lehrer, was the daughter of Jacob and Martha Bodak Lehrer. The family on this side came from a long line of Viennese merchants, ambassadors, physicians. They were a prosperous class growing up. My grandfather Jacob also fought for the Kaiser in Germany in World War I, was injured in Italy, and did receive as well the Iron Cross Medal. My grandparents married in Vienna. My mother was born in 1922, and her sister Gretel was born in 1926. The picture that you see there is of my grandfather Jacob, my grandmother Martha. My mother is on the side of her father, and my Aunt Gretel is on the other side. My mother recalled a life of privilege. Her parents first started with a small grocery store in Vienna, and by the time my mother was born, they had the largest delicatessen in Vienna. It was a city block long. My mother recalled that she went to private school. They had governesses. She had the best of clothing, the best medical care. They were reformed in their beliefs and just had very special, wonderful lives. And then the Anschluss came on March 12, 1938, and their world came tumbling down. My mother was not allowed to go to school anymore. They actually witnessed Kristallnacht from their window of their apartment. The SS moved into the apartment above my family, and they lived in total terror. My grandfather felt it would pass, that he was a war hero. They would never come for a prosperous merchant, a benevolent person. And he just wanted to stay low and let it pass. My grandmother was a feisty, strong businesswoman and didn't believe it would pass. So she actually wrote to my grandfather's brother Sam in New York and got him to sponsor the family to come to America. And then she stood days in line at the U.S. consulate to get the papers that were needed, and there were many, to get the family out. And once she had all the papers in order, they made a plan to leave. They turned over their store, their apartment, all their possessions, and they left in 1939 after Kristallnacht. And they were the lucky ones. But when they arrived in New York, they were as poor as my father, and my mother also did not know English and had been totally uprooted. So what we have here in the picture of my mother, that was when she was 16 years old, when she was leaving Vienna. That actually came off of her visa application. The picture on top shows my great-grandmother and my great-aunt, and they did not make it through the Holocaust. They were unable to travel, and they, along with many family on my father's side and my mother's side, were killed. The picture at the grocery store, that's really a little bit later. When they arrived in New York, my grandfather and grandmother opened a small grocery store on 2nd Avenue in Manhattan, and that's actually just the grocery store. And although they never could obtain the style of life that they had in Vienna, They had a business, they never went hungry, and it was an honest business. So that's the story of how they all came to New York.
Well, and in your book, you do talk about though that right, the differences, the economic differences, right, in your parents' stories, and that your mother's side of the family, because of their status, their place in society, they did start with having access, in being able to, even though it was hard, they had to wait in line, I believe you said for days. Days on end to obtain the right documentation, to get the right kind of sponsorship from family, that they were able to leave, even though it was with nothing. That they had to leave all of their belongings behind. They had to turn over their business to the Nazis, right? They had to leave everything there, and they weren't able to take any of their wealth with them. But that they were at least able to do that based off of connection and status and pieces like that. And some of your father's story, it was a little harder to get out of the country. That him with his Austrian passport was able to do so much more easily than the rest of his family. And why there was such struggle, because they were born in Poland, right? And so we can see, even from these two stories, the differences, that not everyone has the same story, that even people that wanted to leave, or that were wanted to because they were being forced out, right? That felt the need to leave in order to save their families, that it was not the same situation, not everyone had the same access. Or even in, as this top right picture here, is that your great-grandmother? Is that right?
My great-grandmother and great-aunt.
And your great-aunt.
Picture of a few. They both sides of the family didn't get everybody out.
Yeah, and because of health, because of many reasons, she had to stay behind, and your great-aunt stayed to take care of her, and thus both perishing at that time. So I think, even your parents' stories, even in and of itself, show the diversity in experience, right? And what people went through, and how easy or hard it was, and what some of those barriers were to get. But luckily they did. They came from a similar area, but with very, very different stories. And so I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how they met, right? Okay. How this story kind of continues a little bit.
I'd be glad to. My parents would have never met in Vienna, because my father was Orthodox poor and my mother was Reformed wealthy. So they met in New York, equal actually. The story they loved to tell was that they both were taking English in night school in New York. And the professor handed out the English compositions that he required them to write. And when they got to my mother's paper, Herr Solera, he said that was the worst composition in the class. And this was appalling to my mother, and she cried, because in Vienna, she was one of the smartest people in her class. So after class, my father went up to her and said in German, "My paper was much worse than yours. Would you like to go out for coffee?" And that's how my parents met. So they both lived their lives for a couple of years in New York. My father started working, becoming a draftsman, designing and helping architects. And at night he went to New York University and Columbia to study architecture. My mother wanted to go to college, but there was no money in the family to send her to college. So she got herself a full scholarship to Bethany College in West Virginia, where she went for the next 4 years. She graduated summa cum laude, earned a little extra money helping the German professor, waiting tables, selling candy at Barton's Candy Shop. And meanwhile, my father in 1943 was drafted into the U.S. Army. He served in Louisiana where he did his basic training, and then he was sent to Belvoir, Virginia, where he designed radio towers that were retractable and collapsible barracks for the soldiers. And they saw each other on an occasional weekend. After the war was over, my parents went back to New York. My mother continued her education and got a scholarship to New York University to get a master's in psychology. And my father kept moving up the ladder in his talents and in his schooling to become, his goal was becoming an architect. They married February 2nd, 1946. And those pictures there, that was my mother and father in New York, my mother in college, my father in the Army. And then the other picture is my parents, the only one I could find on their honeymoon. So that's when they married in February 2nd, 1946. 11 months later, my sister Ethel was born. At the time, they were living in a small little apartment and trying to move up. In 1949, when I was born, my father passed his architectural award and then was working as an architect. Life was going much easier for them at the time. He was designing shopping centers and houses and subdivisions and doing rather well. And this bottom picture was the first house my dad designed for the family in Little Neck, New York. And that's where my sister Sharon was born in 1952. In 1955, my mother became very ill, and the doctors recommended that they move to a warmer climate for the winter. My father had a business associate that had a little home in Lake Mary, Florida, no less. And my parents went there for the winter with their 3 little girls. My mother recovered, and my parents fell in love with Florida and decided they would go back to New York, sell the house, pack up, and move to Orlando.
And that's how we got lucky enough to bring your family here, right? Or here, even though you're in New York right now. But to bring you all here and restart life here, and planting those roots that have grown really deep here in our community as your family really has impacted even the skyline of Orlando. And I definitely want to talk more about your family and all the connections and what they experienced and what they shared with you about that, especially at their time in Europe. But I definitely want to kind of close the loop though in bringing us back to your time here in Orlando and what that life was like and all the contributions that your family, that your parents made over the years, and to really honor and celebrate that before we talk a little bit more about some of their experiences.
So the picture you see of the 5 of us, that was maybe a year after we moved to Orlando. My father, mother, and my sister Ethel are in the back row. I'm next to my father, and my sister Sharon's on the other side. So we moved to Orlando in 1956. And at the time, there were not a lot of Jewish people in Orlando, and there certainly weren't a lot of Holocaust survivors in Orlando. So my father started as a junior partner, moved up to a senior partner in an architectural firm, and in 1972 opened his own architectural firm. He was a very successful architect, designed many homes, stores, shopping centers, high-rise buildings. But he found a specialty, and that was in high-rise, low-income apartments for the elderly. And he did them in Orlando, then started doing them in Florida, and then in the southeast part of the United States. He, the bottom picture, this white house that you see there, we always call that a butterfly roof. That was our first house he designed in Orlando. And we lived there for about 20 years. And recently it was in the Parade of Homes as, the mid-century architecture coming back. That's actually, when we took that picture, that the sign there is from the Parade of Homes. Anyway, so he had a very successful career, and there's a small picture on top of that and that was the second home he designed on Lake Conroe in Orlando. But his specialty was, the love he had was for an apartment building called Canaret Apartments, which is in Orlando. There's a sign there. It was for Jewish people. It was a low-income, high-rise apartment building for Jewish people. And he took great pride in being able to help the Orlando Jewish community have a place to go to. After he retired, he was called out of retirement to design Congregation Ahavat Israel, which is the small picture underneath the family picture, and that's the Chabad of Maitland, Florida. And after he died, they dedicated the sanctuary to my dad, and that's the picture above the house. When my father died, we actually had his memorial service in Canaret because it was such a special place to him. My father died 2008 after an illness, and Orlando has always looked different because of him. There's a picture there of some of the buildings that he designed in Orlando, and it really did change the structure of downtown. My mother, when we came to Orlando, worked as a psychologist for Sunland Hospital, which was a hospital for severely disabled children. After a few years, she started a school and became the principal of a school for mentally handicapped children. When she retired, she volunteered in many organizations, and her favorite one was helping displaced homemakers find new careers. My mother became a weaver in her retirement and did beautiful tapestries for almost everybody in the family. But there's a picture there of one of her tapestries, and this is the ark, the curtain on the ark in Temple Israel, in the old building. And it was a beautiful piece. My parents in Orlando were very generous and benevolent and taught us this, and they always had a deep love of Israel. My sisters and I, when we were growing up in Orlando, went to public school, and we all went to universities and got higher degrees. And we were raised with the values of education and family and charity.
You know, in your book, Judith, you talk about how your parents were never in concentration camps themselves, but how deeply the Holocaust impacted your family. Obviously, the extended family that almost all perished in the Holocaust, as well as how it impacted the few that did survive. But we can also see that even from those few survivors, such as your parents, what great wealth of love and character and what they were able to build, literally build, and create family, not only for your blood family, right, but for the community as a whole. And so it's really beautiful to see that as much as they went through, even in that survival, right, how hard that was for them, knowing what they left behind and what was taken from them, that they were able to build this life and pass along all of this caring duty to other people as well. So I wanted to thank you for sharing that, first of all, because it was wonderful when you were able to do that with me the first time, and I'm so glad that we're able to share that with the community. But I was wondering also if you wouldn't mind, since you started reading with that prologue, if you would mind reading the epilogue. We'll definitely talk some more after that as well. Tons of questions, both from myself as well as the community. But I would love for you to pull that all together, and then afterwards maybe share some of those no coincidences that are at the end of your book as well.
Okay. The epilogue. My parents each had to leave their home, culture, language, and all that they knew of life. They had to learn how hard and cruel life could be, all because they were Jewish. Although they did not go to the concentration camps like 6 million others, they were victims as well. They lost family, friends, their homes, and their way of life. And they lost their innocence. And they were the lucky ones. They survived. My parents were immigrants arriving in the United States with no money and no knowledge of English. They had to overcome many of the hardships that immigrants must face. Through education, ambition, and drive, they made a life together raising their children. Education, education, education is how we were raised. I always remember them saying, no one can take away your education. The other quote that we heard all the time was, family is who you can count on. Those two quotes were how we lived our lives. Now we are in our family's third generation in America since my parents arrived. My parents would be so proud. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren have continued as good Jewish Americans and good, honest people.
You know, Judith, this actually wasn't necessarily part of the questions that we discussed, but I'm wondering, how did your parents talk about their experience in the Holocaust? Did they readily share stories? Because obviously you're able to write them down here for us. But was this something that they always talked about? Did they share their story with other people or your family?
Well, my parents told the story so many times and so often that I can't remember not knowing the story. They didn't hold back at all. They wanted their stories told. In Orlando, they never felt like Holocaust survivors because they weren't in the camp, but they always felt victimized. And we were raised European values, and I can never remember not knowing. And the thing is that my parents have told our sons the story, and they know all the stories just like I did.
What made you decide to write it down in this book?
I am
Because you just did it last year, right? You just did it last year.
I'm really glad you asked that question. I've had the stories in my head 2 years. When we met Harry Cohen is when I learned there were no coincidences. But I never felt that I could tell their story while they were alive because it was their story. And after they died, I felt it was the time that I could tell, as their daughter, I could tell their story. But on my father's deathbed in 2008, one of the last things he asked of me was he made me promise to tell his story. And I didn't do it for 12 years. One, my mother was alive for 10 more years, but it was hard to get out of park. It was hard to start. And after my mother died, my sister Ethel and I went to the Holocaust Center to make a donation in their memory. And I will never forget, we were sitting with the director's hand making this donation, and I started to tell her the story. And it just started to come out, and that's when I realized that the time was now to tell the story. And shortly thereafter that, we flew to New York for Purim, and then COVID happened. And we were locked down as the whole world was. So we were in a small apartment in New York City for 3 months, not able to walk out the door. And it came to me that this is the time to write the story. So I spent the 3 months in lockdown writing the story. And then when we got home to Orlando, I spent another 3 months getting the documentation, getting the photographs, and then I took the ambitious project of doing extensive family trees on both sides. And that was a really ambitious project because we had family everywhere. During the war, all the family in Europe would go to any country that would take them to save their lives. and they all remained in those countries and had children and grandchildren in those countries. So my story brought the family together too. And I found that I had cousins in Israel, Canada, Australia, France, England, Brazil, the United States, Belgium, Austria, this, from everywhere. So when I wrote them that I'd written my parents' story and I wanted to put them in the family tree, I got some really wonderful responses. And that kind of brought our family all together.
Actually, I was curious about that, like how not only your family's history, in your parents sharing all of that with your family, but also in you writing this book, how has that impacted your family?
Well, I want to say from the start that I have an older sister and a younger sister who are very dear to my heart. And I asked them if that would be okay that I shared my mom and dad's story. And they were not only pleased about me doing it, but they were very, very supportive. And when I made the book, I self-published the book for all my parents' ancestors. And when I gave them the book, much to my delight, some of them, I got such positive responses that they asked for more books to give it to their children and their grandchildren. So the impact, I think, is very large. And I think the impact is also unknown because the next generation and maybe the next generation, some descendant will pick up this book and learn about the Holocaust and learn about immigrants trying to survive and be proud of their family.
Oh, I think that is so important, and I don't think I can stress that enough, is that you don't always know who's going to be interested and who's going to connect with it, or who's going to connect with it at some point in the future, right? But putting this together is a treasure for your family, for the community, of course, you know. But I myself, I'm incredibly interested in my family's Jewish genealogy. And I just got off the phone actually with someone earlier today that was calling the center about where to start and how to research and learn more about their family's history. And so putting this together, I think, is just a beautiful gift also to future generations. And I'm going to thank you on behalf of future generations, because I'm one of those people that wish people had done that, you know, 1 or 2 generations back. Like how wonderful that would be. So it's wonderful that you did that. And I noticed that the name of your book is titled Journey. Was there a particular reason that you chose that name?
So the book was finished with no title. And my husband and I were on the kayak going around the lake, and it just came from, I don't know, a higher source. Journey, that's what I need to call this book. And I never questioned it, and I named it that. And I think it was my parents' journey from Vienna to Orlando and all that it entailed and how difficult it was. But then it became my journey. It became my journey to discover their history and the journey to share it with others. And so it was all of our journey.
And I know you feel very, very strongly about being able to share that book with everyone, right?
I do. I only self-published it for our family, never wanting to sell it, make money off of it. It was really for our family. But the Holocaust Center will be able to upload it and have it digitally if anybody's interested in it.
Yes, absolutely. And by the way, you all will get information on that. Judith has been so kind to share this book with all of us that when we do upload the video recording of this session, we will also make sure on our website that we put the PDF to the book that will be there completely free to download. Judith felt very strongly that she wanted to make sure that it was free and open to the community to read. So thank you for that as well. As you were talking, Judith, especially when you were mentioning that you had that you have discovered family from all around the world. We actually did have a question come in. And so I wanted to make sure, this is from Sarah Burns. Do you have any distant family who immigrated to Israel after World War II? If so, did you try to find them? And I wonder if you wanted to share about that. And part of the no coincidences is you finding family. So did you want to share a little bit?
Actually, I have family on both my mother's and my father's side that went to Israel. And a cute story that you don't even know, Rachel. But when my husband and I
it's a bonus for me.
made our first trip to Israel, actually the same time as one of the no coincidences stories, my father had family there, and he had arranged with his cousin that when I got off the plane, I'd have this big J on my shirt so that they could pick me out at the airport. And when my dad and mom took us to the airport, he hands me this J and he says, put this on when you get off the plane because you're going to find your family. So I went, oh, okay. So that's what I did. And I found the most wonderful family on my father's side, cousins and second cousins. And to this day, they've visited us in Florida. We have gone to Israel multiple times. And they are the Lampa family, and they are a delightful family. Then I found family on my mother's side too, as well. So when we actually go to Israel, when we had our son Jacob's bar mitzvah there, we could have had 50 family members from Israel, not from the United States, that all came there. So if we have time, I would love to share how I found my mother's family.
Well, yeah, we have just under 10 minutes left. And some of the pieces that I loved the most about your book is at the very end, you have these 3 short stories that relate to this idea that there are no coincidences. So I don't know if you want to go through all of them or if you want to pick and choose, but would you mind sharing a little bit about those?
Okay.
Because they're fun and beautiful.
First of all, in the beginning of my book, I have a quote from Elie Wiesel, and the quote is, in Jewish history, there are no coincidences. And I learned from Harry Cohen that there are no coincidences. You just have to have your eyes open and be aware and set them to see these things. Because I think these no coincidences happen to many, many people, but it takes having your eyes open to see it. So when Bob and I went to Israel on the same trip with the J story, it was a little bit after that. In 1983, the bottom picture there, I'll explain that. My parents were going on a UJA mission to Israel, and they were friends with a couple in Orlando called the Shifleys. And the Shifleys were friends with Menachem Begin, the prime minister, and his wife, and had asked my parents to bring a suitcase to the Begin. So my parents went, sure. I mean, to meet the prime minister and his wife just by bringing a suitcase, they thought that was a great idea. So when they got to Israel, they called Mrs. Begin on the phone and said they had a suitcase from the Shifleys. And Mrs. Begin invited them over for tea and to bring the suitcase. And when my parents arrived at the residence, Mrs. Begin said, you have accents, where are you from? And my mother said, we are from Vienna. Mrs. Begin said, one of my dearest friends is from Vienna. Do you know Ernst Sylvia? And my mother goes, that's my cousin. And I haven't heard from him since the war. So Mrs. Begin called Ernst on the phone and he came right over. And that picture on the bottom is Prime Minister Begin and Ernst Sylvia. And Ernst has a delightful family, he had a wife, a daughter, Naomi, and a son, Jonathan, who was killed in the Yom Kippur War. Well, years later, we met the family, and I have to say that Naomi is one of my dearest friends, and we are always in contact with each other, and that's how I met my mother's family in Israel.
And you didn't even know that part of the family, that part of that family survived, right? I mean,
I didn't know that then.
Yeah, and so through some of your also research and other people researching their families,
No coincidence.
other people were able to connect with you. Is that right?
That's right. It's supposed to be. We call it the sheriff, meant to be.
And I think, is that what the picture, the top left picture?
The picture in the top left, the person next to me is our cousin Jasmine, and she contacted my mother in 2011 from Vienna, and she said, I think that we're related. Well, my mother was very, very nervous about anybody contacting her from Vienna because she never got over that trauma, and told Jasmine to contact me. So through many emails and scans, she sent actually a photo of my mother as a little girl and her sister Gretel as a baby. She really was our family. It took her 6 months to find my mother. She was very motivated because she had lost her grandmother, her mother, and her twin brother in a short span of time. And her sister Iris had already gone to Israel. And she wanted to find her family. And when she did, she flew to Orlando almost immediately, left her husband with the 2 little kids, and my sister Sharon, my cousin Etsy, my sister Ethel, and my mom. We all had this marvelous reunion with Jasmine. And I have to say that Jasmine now knows our children and our grandchildren, and I'm in touch with her every day. But that photo shows Jasmine, my mother, my sister Ethel, Jasmine, me, my sister Ethel, my mother, and my sister Sharon.
Beautiful. You know, we're coming short on time right now, but I wanted to make special note that not only are you being so kind to share your story, but the book with everyone, you're hopefully also going to be volunteering, and as you stated, you really wanted to speak to young folks, and that's something that we try to do as much as possible, is to get in the classroom, talk to students of all ages, not only to teach them the history of the Holocaust, but really the holistic story and humanizing those that it impacted, right? And bringing those stories back to life. And so
I feel very strongly about that because the survivors are dying off, and those that are left are very sick and old. And I think it's our job as children of survivors and victims that we continue these stories. And actually, that is what I want to do with this next phase of my life, is to tell the story of the Holocaust and of immigration and of family and commitment. And I just, that's the future. We have to tell the past to learn the future.
And as you get ready to speak to lots of students in Central Florida and probably beyond now because of Zoom, what is the one thing that you want students to learn or take away from hearing your parents' story?
I want them to learn about the Holocaust, and that being Jewish and also being minorities of any sort, of what prejudice feels like. I want them to know that immigrants can make it through family and education and drive. They can make it. And I want them to, it's so important that the lessons from the Holocaust do not fade away, and that they are told and learned. So hopefully, it will never happen again.
Absolutely. Couldn't say it better. Thank you so much, Judith. Thank you so much for being here. I'm hoping there are many programs in the future that we can partner on together. And as a reminder to everyone that's out there watching, her story, the book Journey, will be available for everyone to download just later today, probably, once we are able to get the recording of this program up on our website. And you'll be receiving an email with that information, as well, of course, with a link to our survey. If you can provide us feedback, we're always looking to learn from and improve our programming. And of course, all of our programs that we have here on these kinds of Zoom calls, we're providing them absolutely free to the community. We believe in having as much open access to these stories as possible. It's very important, but they're only possible from our generous donors. So if you'd like to help support programs in the future, we're going to put a link in the chat box, and there'll also be information in the email that you'll receive if you'd like to support continuing programming just like this. So thank you so much, Judith. Was there any last thing that you wanted to say to our community?
I just very briefly, that top picture there is a picture of me and a lady named Ann Addison. And I met her in a synagogue, in our synagogue in New York. She sat beside me, heard I was from Orlando, and said she knew an architect that moved to Orlando, and she knew my dad. And she's a delightful woman, and every time we're in New York, we visit Ann Addison.
The connections are far and wide.
Just open your eyes.
Open your eyes. No coincidences. Thank you so much, Judith. Thank you all for being with us today. And I hope you all have a...
Thank you very much for asking me.
Of course, it was a pleasure. Everyone have a wonderful day, and we will see you next time. Bye.
Thank you.